The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Camilla Parker Bowles stepped out onto the ancient stones. Her heels clicked with measured precision, each step deliberate and calculated. She had waited decades for this moment, endured countless whispers behind gloved hands, survived the brutal scrutiny of tabloids and the cold shoulders of a nation that had loved another woman. But now, finally, she wore the crown. She was queen consort. She intended everyone to remember it. The royal guard stood at attention in their iconic red uniforms and towering bearskin hats, their faces stoic and expressionless as they had been trained to be. They were the very symbol of British tradition. Men and women who had pledged their lives to serve the monarchy with unwavering dedication. Among them stood Captain James Thornbury, a decorated officer with 20 years of service under his belt. He had served under Queen Elizabeth II with distinction, had stood guard during moments of national celebration and mourning alike. His loyalty to the crown was absolute. Carved into his very bones through years of disciplined service, Camilla surveyed the assembled guards with a critical eye. She had noticed something in recent weeks, a subtle hesitation in some of their salutes when she passed, a fractional delay that spoke volumes. It gnawed at her, this feeling that respect was being given grudgingly rather than freely. She had discussed it with her advisors in private chambers, voicing her frustrations over tea and biscuits. They had assured her it was all in her imagination, that the guards were impeccably professional. But Camilla knew better. She had spent too many years reading the unspoken language of British aristocracy to miss the subtle signs of disapproval. That morning, she had decided enough was enough. She would establish her authority once and for all, would demand the respect she felt was her due. After all, she had married the king. She stood beside Charles as he assumed the throne his entire life had prepared him for. The crown might sit on his head, but she stood at his side, and that meant something. That had to mean something. She stopped directly in front of the formation, her chin lifted at an imperious angle. The guards remained perfectly still, their eyes fixed on some distant point as protocol demanded. Camilla could see her own reflection in the polished buttons of their uniforms. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her shoulders like an ermine cloak. "Guards," she began, her voice carrying across the courtyard with surprising strength. Several palace staff members who had been going about their morning duties paused, sensing something unusual in the air. "I have served this family for many years. I have endured more than most could imagine. And now, I stand before you as your queen." The guards remained motionless, but Captain Thornbury felt a twinge of unease ripple through his chest. Something in her tone suggested this was not going to be a routine inspection or a simple word of encouragement. He had heard that tone before in officers who felt their authority slipping and sought to reclaim it, through force rather than earning it through respect. Camilla's eyes swept across the line of guards, landing on each face for just a moment before moving on. "There seems to be some confusion about the proper respect owed to my position," she continued, her voice growing sharper. "Some of you seem to forget that when you salute. When you stand at attention, you do so not just for tradition's sake, but because I am your queen. I will not tolerate half-hearted gestures or reluctant acknowledgement." A breeze rustled through the courtyard, carrying with it the scent of the palace gardens where roses bloomed in defiant beauty. Somewhere in the distance, a clock tower chimed, marking the hour. The moments stretched taut as a violin string. Then Camilla spoke the words that would echo through the palace halls for days to come. Her voice rang out clear and commanding, filled with all the pent-up frustration and wounded pride of her long journey to this position. "Bow before your queen," she declared. "I want to see every one of you acknowledge me properly. Not just a salute. I want you to bow." Now, the silence that followed was deafening. Even the birds in the nearby trees seemed to stop their morning songs. The palace staff, who had been watching from windows and doorways, held their collective breath. This was unprecedented. Guards did not bow during duty. They saluted. They stood at attention. They followed centuries of established protocol that had been refined through generations of service. What Camilla was demanding flew in the face of everything the royal guard, represented. Captain Thornberry felt every muscle in his body tense. His mind raced through his training, through the regulations he had memorized as a young recruit, through the examples set by the officers who had mentored him. He thought of Queen Elizabeth II, who had never demanded such gestures, who had earned devotion through quiet dignity rather than imperious commands. He thought of his fellow guards, standing beside him, waiting to see how he would respond. Camilla's eyes locked onto him, recognizing him as the senior officer present. "Captain," she said, her voice dropping to a more personal register, but losing none of its steel, "you will lead by example. Bow before your queen." The courtyard seemed to shrink around them, the ancient stones bearing witness to this confrontation between old tradition and new authority. Captain Thornberry could feel the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. The expectations of every guard who had stood in this courtyard before him, the legacy of service that stretched back centuries. He had served Queen Elizabeth with love and devotion. He had wept at her funeral, along with millions around the world. He had sworn his oath to serve the crown, to protect and honor the monarchy. But that oath came with responsibilities, with an understanding of what the crown represented. It was not about personal power or wounded pride. It was about something larger than any individual, a symbol of continuity and stability that transcended the flaws and ambitions of those who wore it. Camilla waited, her expression a mixture of expectation and challenge. She had drawn her line in the sand, had made her demand in front of witnesses. To back down now would undermine the very authority she sought to establish. But to press forward risked something far more dangerous: a rupture between the institution and those sworn to protect it. "Captain," Thornberry's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He could feel the eyes of his fellow guards on him, could sense the watching staff members holding their breath, could imagine the gossip that would spread through London drawing rooms by evening. This moment would define not just his response to Camilla, but his understanding of what his oath truly meant. In the space of a heartbeat, he made his choice. His loyalty was not to a person seeking validation, but to the principles that the crown was meant to embody. He would do his duty, but he would do it in a way that honored the true meaning of service. The morning sun continued its slow climb across the sky, different to the human drama playing out below. History waited, patient and eternal, to see how this moment would unfold. Captain James Thornberry stood perfectly still, his mind working through the implications of this moment with lightning speed. He was a man who had built his entire adult life around service, discipline, and honor. His father had been a guardsman before him, and his grandfather had served in World War II with distinction. The military was not just his career, but his identity, woven into every fiber of his being. He understood chain of command, respected authority, and had never once questioned an order that fell within the bounds of proper protocol. But this order troubled him deeply. It was not about the physical act of bowing. He had bowed before royalty countless times at formal ceremonies, at state occasions, at moments prescribed by centuries of tradition. What bothered him was the demand itself, the tone, the context. Camilla was asking him to set aside protocol, not to honor tradition, but to satisfy what appeared to be a personal need for validation. She wanted submission, not respect. And there was a crucial difference between the two. He thought about Queen Elizabeth II, who had passed away just months earlier. She had never demanded anything from her guards beyond their duty. She had walked among them with quiet grace, had remembered their names and asked about their families, had earned their devotion through example rather than command. When guards bowed to her, it was because they wanted to, because her very presence inspired that gesture. She had understood something fundamental about leadership that Camilla seemed to have missed. True authority cannot be demanded, only earned. Camilla's expression was growing impatient. The silence had stretched on longer than she had anticipated, and doubt began to creep into her eyes. She had expected immediate compliance, a swift bow from the captain, followed by the rest of the guard. Instead, she faced stillness and resistance, wrapped in the guise of perfect military bearing. The watching staff members were now openly staring, abandoning any pretense of going about their duties. "Captain Thornberry," Camilla repeated, her voice rising slightly with an edge of frustration. "I am waiting. This is a direct order from your Queen Beau." Now. James felt a bead of sweat form at his temple, despite the cool morning air. His heart pounded in his chest, though his expression remained neutral. He was acutely aware that whatever he said next would reverberate far beyond this courtyard. The other guards were depending on him to navigate this impossible situation. The institution itself was depending on him to uphold its principles while respecting the crown. He took a measured breath and spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. It was firm but respectful, the voice of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "Your Majesty," he began, using her proper title with deliberate precision, "I bow to the crown, not to the person." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Camilla's face went through a rapid succession of expressions: shock, confusion, anger, and something else that might have been hurt. She had not expected this. She had not prepared for a guard to refuse her, to challenge her authority so directly, and yet so respectfully that she could not easily dismiss it as insubordination. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Though everyone present heard it perfectly in the sudden stillness, Captain Thornberry maintained his rigid posture, his eyes fixed straight ahead as regulation required. "I said, Your Majesty, that I bow to the crown, not to the person. My oath is to the institution of the monarchy, to the principles and traditions it represents. I honor you as Queen Consort, and I salute you as protocol demands. But to bow outside of ceremonial context, at personal command rather than traditional requirement, would dishonor both my uniform and the very institution you represent." A palisade who had been standing near the entrance gasped audibly. This was unprecedented. Guards did not speak to royalty this way, did not explain or justify their actions, did not offer lessons in constitutional monarchy to their supposed superiors. Yet there was something undeniably powerful in Captain Thornberry's words, clarity that cut through pretension and ego to touch something fundamental. Camilla's hands trembled slightly at her sides. She felt exposed, diminished, made to look foolish in front of staff who would certainly gossip about this encounter for months to come. Her first instinct was to lash out, to have him removed from duty, to punish this insolence with swift and decisive action. She could feel the rage building in her chest, hot and bitter. But somewhere beneath the anger, a small voice whispered doubt. Was he wrong? Had she overstepped? She thought of Charles, who had always navigated his role with careful attention to tradition and protocol. She thought of Elizabeth, who had ruled for 70 years without ever needing to demand the respect that flowed to her naturally. She thought of Diana, beloved by the people in a way that Camilla had never been and perhaps never would be. Precisely because Diana had seemed vulnerable and human rather than imperious. Captain Thornberry continued, sensing perhaps that this was a moment for truth rather than diplomacy. "Your Majesty, the guards serve the crown with pride and dedication. We would lay down our lives for the royal family without hesitation. But our service is to something larger than any individual. It is to the continuity of British tradition, to the principles that have sustained this monarchy through centuries of change. When you ask us to bow outside of proper context, you ask us to diminish the very institution you seek to honor?" Another guard, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, who had joined the service only 3 years earlier, felt tears prick at her eyes. She had idolized Captain Thornberry as a mentor, had learned from his example what it meant to serve with integrity. Now she watched him risk everything to uphold principles that many in her generation barely understood. She felt a surge of pride in her uniform and her service. The tradition she represented. Camilla looked around the courtyard, seeing the assembled guards with new eyes. They were not her subjects to command as she pleased. They were professionals, dedicated men and women who had chosen a life of service and sacrifice. They followed orders and honored tradition, but they also carried within them the accumulated wisdom of generations of service. They were the guardians not just of physical safety, but of the very meaning of the crown itself. "You dare to lecture me," Camilla said, her voice now controlled but cold as winter frost. "You dare to tell your queen what service means, what the crown represents? I could have you removed from duty this instant, stripped of your rank, sent away in disgrace." Captain Thornberry finally allowed himself to look directly at her, meeting her eyes with steady calm. "Yes, Your Majesty, you could. And if you believe that is what service to the crown requires, then I will accept that consequence. But I will not bow to satisfy personal pride rather than ceremonial tradition. I will not ask my guards to do so either. We serve the crown, Your Majesty, not our own egos and not yours." The gasps from the watching staff were audible now. This had gone far beyond a simple disagreement about protocol. This was a fundamental challenge to Camilla's authority, a rejection of her attempt to establish herself through command rather than example. Every person present understood they were witnessing a defining moment, one that would be whispered about in palace corridors and eventually leaked to the press, where it would be dissected and analyzed endlessly. Camilla felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. She had wanted to establish her authority, to demand the respect she felt was her due. Instead, she had created a confrontation that made her look petty and insecure. The guards had not refused to honor her. They had refused to dishonor themselves and their institution at her command. There was a crucial distinction there, one that cut to the heart of everything wrong with her approach. She thought of Charles again. Wondered what he would say when he heard about this incident, as he inevitably would. Would he support her, stand by her side against this insubordinate guard? Or would he quietly agree with Captain Thornberry, recognizing the wisdom in his words, even if he could not say so publicly? The uncertainty gnawed at her, adding humiliation to her anger. The sun had climbed higher now, its light flooding the courtyard with golden brilliance. The moment could not stretch on forever. Something had to give. Someone had to move. The confrontation had to resolve itself one way or another. Camilla stood at a crossroads, facing a choice that would define her reign as queen consort. The tension in the courtyard had reached an almost unbearable pitch. Staff members who had been watching from windows now crowded closer to doorways, straining to see how this unprecedented confrontation would resolve itself. Some felt sympathy for Camilla, seeing her as a woman who had endured decades of public scrutiny and was simply trying to claim the respect she deserved. Others admired Captain Thornberry's courage, seeing him as a defender of traditions that gave the monarchy its meaning and legitimacy. Camilla's mind raced through her options. She could order Thornberry's immediate removal, could make an example of him that would send a clear message to everyone in the palace. Cross the queen consort at your peril. The power to do so was hers. One word to the right officials, and his career would be over. He would be reassigned to some distant post, quietly sidelined. His years of distinguished service reduced to a footnote ending in disgrace. But even as she considered this option, Camilla recognized the trap it represented. If she destroyed Thornberry for refusing an improper order, she would confirm everything her critics said about her. She would be the vindictive interloper who could not earn genuine respect and therefore demanded empty gestures of submission. The story would leak, as palace stories always did, and the public reaction would be savage. She could already imagine the tabloid headlines, the social media firestorm, the renewed calls for her to step back from public life. More importantly, and this thought surprised her with its clarity, she would be proving Thornberry right. If she punished him for upholding the principles of service and tradition, she would demonstrate that her concern was personal power rather than institutional integrity. She would become exactly what she feared people already thought she was: someone who cared more about her own status than about the crown itself. Captain Thornberry maintained his rigid posture, waiting for her response with the same calm discipline he had shown throughout the encounter. He had no idea whether he would leave this courtyard still wearing his uniform or stripped of everything he had worked for. The risk had been enormous, the stakes impossibly high. But he had spoken his truth, had defended principles he believed were worth defending, and he would accept whatever consequences followed. The other guards stood like statues, their faces betraying nothing of the turmoil they felt inside. Many of them were thinking about their own oaths, their own understanding of what service meant. Captain Thornberry had articulated something they all felt, but perhaps could not have expressed so clearly, that true loyalty to the crown meant serving its highest ideals, not its temporary occupants' personal desires. Sarah Mitchell, the young guard. found herself thinking about why she had joined the royal guard in the first place. It had not been for parades or ceremonies or standing in fancy uniform. It had been because she believed in something larger than herself. A tradition of service that connected her to centuries of dedicated men and women who had put duty above self-interest. Captain Thornberry was embodying that tradition right now. And watching him do so made her proud to wear the same uniform. Camilla closed her eyes briefly, and in that moment of darkness, she saw her life with sudden clarity. She had spent so many years fighting for acceptance, for recognition, for a place beside Charles that the world would acknowledge as legitimate. She had endured hatred and mockery, had been compared unfavorably to a dead woman who had been elevated to sainthood in the public imagination. Every step forward had been a battle, every achievement shadowed by doubts about whether she deserved it. And now here she stood, finally wearing a crown, finally holding a position of authority. And what was she doing with it? She was demanding empty gestures from honorable people, trying to force respect that could only be freely given. She was becoming the caricature her enemies had always painted her as: power-hungry, insecure, unworthy of the role she occupied. The realization hit her with unexpected force. Captain Thornberry had not challenged her to be cruel or insubordinate. He had challenged her because someone needed to, because she had lost her way and needed to be reminded of what the crown actually represented. In his own way, by refusing to bow at her command, he was offering her a kind of respect far more valuable than any gesture. He was treating her as someone capable of understanding and accepting truth, even when it was uncomfortable. She opened her eyes and looked at Captain Thornberry again. Really looked at him this time. She saw not an enemy or an insubordinate soldier, but a man of integrity, trying to serve his country and his crown with honor. She saw the strain in his rigid posture, the courage it took to stand firm against someone who could destroy his career with a word. She saw, perhaps for the first time, what genuine service looked like when stripped of pretense and political calculation. "Captain Thornberry," she said, and her voice was different now, softer, but somehow stronger. The sharp edge of command had been replaced by something more thoughtful, more genuine. "You said you bow to the crown, not to the person." "Yes, Your Majesty," he replied, his voice steady. "And in your understanding, what does the crown represent? What are these principles you believe are worth defending?" The question surprised him. It was not what he had expected. He had braced himself for dismissal or punishment, not for a genuine inquiry into his beliefs. He considered his answer carefully, aware that this might be his last opportunity to explain before facing consequences. "Your Majesty, the crown represents continuity and stability in a changing world. It represents service above self-interest, duty above personal desire. It represents traditions that connect us to our history while adapting to serve each new generation. Most importantly, it represents the idea that some things are larger than any individual, that we are all servants of something greater than ourselves." He paused, then continued with growing confidence. "When Queen Elizabeth II died, we did not just mourn a person. We mourned what she represented, a lifetime of selfless dedication, putting duty before personal happiness, of serving her people with grace and humility. She never demanded respect, Your Majesty. She earned it day after day, year after year, by embodying the very best of what the crown could be." Camilla flinched slightly at the mention of Elizabeth, but she did not interrupt. She recognized truth when she heard it, even when it stung. "Your Majesty," Thornberry continued, his voice gentle now rather than defiant, "you have the opportunity to earn that same respect. Not by demanding we bow, but by showing us why we should want to. Not by commanding submission, but by inspiring devotion through your own service and dedication. The guards will follow you anywhere, will protect you with their lives, will honor you with genuine respect. But only if you honor the institution that gives your position meaning." The courtyard was absolutely silent. Every person present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment of raw honesty that rarely occurred within palace walls. The hierarchies and protocols that normally governed every interaction had dissolved, leaving only two people trying to speak truth to each other across a vast divide of experience and perspective. Camilla felt tears prick at her eyes, as though she refused to let them fall. She thought of all the years she had spent feeling like an outsider, fighting for acceptance from a world that did not want her. She thought of Charles, who loved her, but carried his own burdens of expectation and duty. She thought of Diana's ghost, which seemed to haunt every corridor of every royal residence, a specter of impossible perfection against which she would always be measured and found wanting. But maybe, she thought with sudden clarity, she had been fighting the wrong battle all along. Maybe the point was not to make people see her as she wanted to be seen, but to actually become someone worthy of genuine respect. Maybe Captain Thornberry, in his refusal to bow at her command, was offering her a gift, a chance to start over, to approach her role with humility rather than defensiveness, to earn rather than demand the honor she so desperately wanted. She took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside her chest. The anger and hurt that had driven her to make this ill-considered demand began to drain away, replaced by something that felt almost like relief. She had been given a choice, and she could feel the weight of it settling on her shoulders. She could continue down the path of demanding empty gestures, or she could take the harder road of earning genuine respect through her actions and character. The morning sun continued its steady climb, casting new patterns of light and shadow across the ancient courtyard. Camilla stood perfectly still, and in that stillness, she made her decision. It was not the decision she had imagined making when she walked out here with such determination just minutes earlier. But it was, she realized, the only decision that made any sense if she truly cared about the institution she had married into and the role she had agreed to serve. She straightened her shoulders and met Captain Thornberry's eyes directly. When she spoke, her voice carried a new quality, something the watching staff and guards would later struggle to define but would recognize as significant. It was the voice of someone who had looked into a mirror and decided to change what she saw there. "Captain Thornberry," she began, and this time there was no command in her tone, no demand for submission. "You are quite right. I ask you to bow, not to honor tradition, but to satisfy my own need for validation. That was wrong of me. It dishonored both of us, and it dishonored the institution we both serve." A collective intake of breath rippled through the assembled witnesses. This was not how they had expected this confrontation to end. Royalty did not admit mistakes, did not acknowledge corrections from subordinates, did not climb down from positions they had taken publicly. Yet here was Camilla, doing exactly that. Captain Thornberry felt his rigid posture relax slightly, though he remained at attention. He had not expected this either. He had prepared himself for punishment for the end of his career, for becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of speaking truth to power. Instead, he was witnessing something far more rare and valuable: genuine humility. From someone with the power to avoid it entirely, Camilla continued, her words coming more easily now, as if a dam had broken inside her. "I have spent many years feeling like I do not belong here, like I am an intruder in a world that does not want me. I thought that if I could just make people acknowledge my authority, if I could demand the respect I felt I deserved, then perhaps I would finally feel secure in this role. But you have shown me something important, Captain. Respect cannot be commanded. It can only be earned through actions that honor the principles we claim to serve." She gestured to the assembled guards, including all of them in her remarks. "You stand here every day, in heat and cold, in rain and sun, protecting not just the royal family but the very idea of what we represent. You do this not because anyone forces you to, but because you believe in something larger than yourselves. That is true service, and I've been foolish not to recognize it properly." Sarah Mitchell felt tears streaming down her cheeks now, no longer able to maintain the stoic composure expected of a guard. She had never heard a member of the royal family speak with such raw honesty, such genuine vulnerability. It made Camilla suddenly seem human in a way she never had before, approachable and real, rather than distant and untouchable. Captain Thornberry felt compelled to respond, to acknowledge the courage it had taken for Camilla to admit her mistake publicly. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "it takes great strength to recognize when we have erred, and even greater strength to acknowledge it publicly. Many would have dug in, would have used their power to punish rather than reflect. You have shown wisdom today, and that is worthy of the deepest respect." Camilla smiled slightly, a genuine smile that transformed her face. "Captain, you risked everything to speak truth to me when I needed to hear it. You honored your oath in the deepest way possible, by refusing to compromise your principles, even when it would have been easier and safer to simply comply. That is the kind of service that makes the monarchy worth preserving. Thank you." She turned to address all the guards now, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "I came here this morning with the wrong intentions and the wrong understanding of what leadership means. You have taught me a valuable lesson, one I will not forget. I do not ask for your bows or your submission. I ask only for the opportunity to earn your respect through my actions, through service that honors the crown rather than my own ego." The guards remained at attention, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. The tension that had been coiled so tightly just moments before had released, replaced by something that felt almost like hope. They had witnessed their queen consort acknowledge a mistake, show genuine humility, and demonstrate a willingness to learn and grow. These were qualities worth serving, worth protecting, worth respecting an older staff member. A woman named Margaret, who had served the royal household for 40 years, found herself smiling through tears. She had seen many dramas play out in these palace walls, had witnessed the rise and fall of reputations, had watched the monarchy navigate countless challenges and changes, but she had rarely seen a moment of such genuine transformation, such honest reckoning with difficult truths. Camilla took a step back, preparing to leave the courtyard. But before she did, she offered the guards something she had never given before, a deep, sincere bow of her own. It was not the formal curtsy of ceremony, but something more personal, more genuine. It was an acknowledgement of their service, their dedication, their wisdom. It was a gesture that said more than words ever could about who she wanted to be going forward. Captain Thornberry, following his own instincts, rather than any protocol, returned her bow with one of his own. Then, without any command being given, every guard in the courtyard bowed to their queen consort. It was not the forced gesture she had demanded earlier, but something freely given, offered not because they had to, but because they wanted to. In that moment, Camilla received what she had been seeking all along, genuine respect. Freely offered because it had been genuinely earned. She walked back toward the palace entrance. Her steps different from when she had emerged just a short while earlier. She moved with less rigid formality, but somehow greater dignity. Less concern for appearance, but greater authenticity. The watching staff parted to let her pass, and she noticed the difference in their eyes. The wariness and judgment had been replaced by something warmer, something that looked almost like approval. Inside the palace, Camilla went directly to her private chambers. She sat at her desk and picked up her telephone, dialing Charles's private number. When he answered, she spoke without preamble. "Charles, something happened today. Something important. I need to tell you about it." As she recounted the morning's events to her husband, she found herself able to see it clearly for what it was, a turning point. A moment when she could have continued down a destructive path, or chosen a better one. She had chosen better, and while it had required admitting fault and showing vulnerability, it had also freed something inside her that had been locked away for too long. Charles listened quietly, and when she finished, there was a long pause before he spoke. "Camilla," he said softly, "my mother would have been proud of what you did today. Not of the demand itself, of course, but of your response when you were challenged. That took real courage, real wisdom. That is what being royal truly means, not the titles or the ceremonies, but the willingness to put the institution above our own pride." His words touched something deep inside her, and this time she did let the tears fall. She had spent so many years trying to measure up to Elizabeth's example, feeling like she always fell short, that she could never match the beloved monarch's grace and dedication. But perhaps, she thought, she did not need to be Elizabeth. Perhaps she only needed to be the best version of herself, learning from her mistakes and growing into the role with humility and determination. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened in the courtyard spread throughout the palace and eventually beyond. But the story that spread was not the one Camilla had feared. It was not a tale of a queen consort humiliated by an insubordinate guard. Instead, it became a story of wisdom, of growth, of a woman who had the courage to admit when she was wrong, and the grace to learn from it. Captain Thornberry was not punished or reassigned. Instead, he received a personal letter from Camilla thanking him for his service and his integrity. The letter became one of his most treasured possessions, a reminder of a day when speaking truth had led not to punishment but to mutual respect and understanding. The guards found themselves serving with renewed dedication, inspired by a queen consort who had shown herself willing to listen and learn. Sarah Mitchell, the young guard who had cried during the confrontation, would later say that this was the moment she truly understood what service meant, not blind obedience, but principled dedication to ideals larger than any individual. Camilla herself felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She no longer felt the constant need to prove herself, to demand acknowledgement, to fight for validation. She began to understand. That respect was not something that could be forced or commanded, but something that grew naturally when people saw authentic dedication to duty and genuine concern for the institution over personal pride. She started attending more events with the guards, learning their names, asking about their families, showing genuine interest in their lives and service. She met with Captain Thornberry several times, seeking his advice on how to better serve the role she occupied. These conversations, frank and honest, helped her develop a deeper understanding of what the crown represented and how she could best honor it. Months later, at a formal ceremony honoring long-serving guards, Camilla gave a speech that many would remember as one of her finest moments. She spoke about service and sacrifice, about the importance of integrity and principle, about the courage it takes to speak truth even when it is uncomfortable. And though she never mentioned that morning in the courtyard by name, everyone who had been there understood what she was really talking about. The crown, she said, her voice clear and strong, is not about power or authority or demanding submission. It is about service, about dedication to principles larger than ourselves, about having the humility to admit when we are wrong and the wisdom to learn from those around us. The guards who protect us every day understand this in ways that those of us who wear crowns sometimes forget. They serve not the person, but the institution, not ego, but ideal. That is what makes their service noble, and what makes this institution worth preserving. As she spoke, she caught Captain Thornberry's eye in the audience. He stood at attention as protocol required, but she could see the respect in his gaze, respect that had been earned rather than commanded, given freely rather than forced. She smiled slightly, acknowledging the journey they had both traveled from that morning confrontation to this moment of mutual understanding. The applause that followed her speech was genuine and heartfelt. People recognized that they were witnessing not just words, but a reflection of real change, real growth, real understanding. Camilla had transformed from someone who demanded respect into someone who inspired it through her actions and character. That evening, as she and Charles prepared for bed, he took her hand and looked at her with pride. "You have found your place," he said simply. "Not by demanding it, but by earning it. That is what true royalty means." Camilla thought back to that morning in the courtyard, to the moment when she had stood at a crossroads facing a choice between pride and wisdom. She thought about Captain Thornberry's words, about bowing to the crown rather than the person, about service to ideals rather than egos. She thought about how close she had come to making a terrible mistake, and how grateful she was that someone had cared enough about the institution to stop her. "I had a good teacher," she said softly, thinking of the guard who had risked everything to speak truth, and of the lesson that had changed everything.